It's wonderful to be back with you once again, to see so many faces that are familiar and some new faces as well, and to hear such a wonderful cascade of beautiful music as well as such a heartfelt prayer. It's a delight to be with you here today. Today we're going to be looking at the 10 Commandments of the Old Testament, and we'll do that in both hours. For the first hour, I'm going to be looking at the question of their civil application, how we apply the 10 Commandments to the civil society in which we live. And in the next hour, I'll be looking at what we sometimes call pedagogical or teaching application, that is, how the 10 Commandments are used to convict people of their sins. And to understand this, I'm just going to say very quickly, we'll cover this in greater detail in the next hour. The 10 Commandments and the law cannot save anyone. Nevertheless, the law is instrumental in our salvation because the law shows us our sin and our need for salvation. Now, this came to a head. We've been fighting about these things, the 10 Commandments displays in public, for quite some time. But just a couple of days ago, Andy Stanley of North Point Ministries in Atlanta issued a statement in which he says Christians need to stop erecting monuments to the 10 Commandments because they no longer apply to today. They don't apply to the church today. He goes on to say, if we are going to create a monument to stand as a testament to our faith, shouldn't it at least be a monument of something that actually applies to us? Participants in the new covenant, that's Christians, are not required to obey any of the commandments found in the first part of their Bibles. I wonder if he really thought that through very carefully. Does he mean by that we're free to murder, we're free to steal, we're free to commit adultery and the like? I wonder how thoroughly he thought that through. Now, it is true, and I'm going to be dealing with this more in the next hour, we are under grace, not under law, but we'll talk in the next hour of what that actually means. Doesn't mean that the law has no application today. As to the application of the law today, I'd like us to look to Deuteronomy chapter 4. Can you recall what Deuteronomy is? Deuteros meaning second, nomos meaning law, the second statement of the law. We find the law given to us in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers. Deuteronomy is sort of like Moses' farewell address, you might say. It is not only his farewell address, but it is a statement in which Moses gives a new summary of the law in the form of a legal code. And the 10 Commandments here are restated, and they're restated in a way that they would be a code for the government of Israel. But do they apply only to Israel, or can other nations use them as well? Let's look to Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 5. Moses is speaking, God is speaking through Moses to Israel. Behold, I have taught you statutes and judgments, even as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should go and do them. So you should so do in the land whither you go to possess it. Keep, therefore, and to do them, for this is your understanding, and your understanding in the sight of the nations, which shall hear all these statutes and say, surely this nation is a wise and wonderful people. For what nation is there so great, who hath God so nigh unto them, as the Lord our God is in all things that we call upon him for? And what nation is there so great that hath statutes and judgments so righteous as all this law which I set before you this day? What we are being told here is that while the law is given to Israel, it has application as a model for other nations as well. And as to how the law applies to these other nations, let's take a look at some of this. Now, I recall that way back in 1956, there was a movie that came out, The 10 Commandments. Some of us here are old enough to remember seeing it. Some of us are young enough to see it in the reruns that usually you find at Easter time. There's a new updated edition in this, but that new edition is not accurate because, as we all know, Moses looked very much like Charlton Heston, and Pharaoh looked very much like Yul Brynner. But a lot of us don't remember that in the uncut version of this, when it first came out, Cecil B. DeMille did something very unusual. He opened it by stepping out on stage in the movie wearing a business suit to introduce the movie to the audience. And here is just a part of what he said. "Ladies and gentlemen, young and old, this may seem an unusual procedure, but we have an unusual subject: the birth of freedom, the story of Moses. The theme of this picture is whether men ought to be ruled by God's laws or whether they are to be ruled by the whims of a dictator like Ramesses. Are men the property of the state, or are they free souls under God? This same battle continues throughout the world today." What does the Ten Commandments have to do with freedom? Well, we're going to see that as we see the basic principles in the Ten Commandments. Basic principles that are of universal application. Now, some of the law, some of the Old Testament law, is what Luther called Sachsenspiegel, that is, law that has unique application to Israel and doesn't apply to the rest of society. But part of it is what he called Gesetz or Recht, that is, righteousness or justice, moral principles that are of universal application. And Luther insisted that the Ten Commandments are very much in the latter category and are of universal application because, he says, they are the perfect expression of the natural law that is written on men's hearts. But what principles do we see there in the law of Moses? What principles do we see in the Ten Commandments, which is a summary of the rest of the law? First, respect for God. Because God is the source of all governmental authority, as we are told in Daniel 2 and told in Romans 13. God is the source of all governmental authority. Not only that, God is also the source of limitations on governmental authority. As Jesus told the Pharisees, remember when the Pharisees came to Jesus and asked him that trick question of do we pay taxes to Caesar or no? And this was a question that was intended to entrap him, because if he answered, yes, pay your taxes, then his popularity in the next Jerusalem poll would be down about 90 points because they didn't like paying taxes any more than we do. But if he said no, then they'd go and tattle to the Romans and he'd get arrested, and either way they thought they were rid of him. And so Jesus didn't give a direct answer to the question, and when you're the Son of God, you don't have to. But he gave them something to think about that was beyond anything that it was in their imaginations. He asked them to show him a coin. They did. Whose image is this? Caesar's. And then he said, render therefore unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. Here he gave to Caesar a recognition of authority that they had not known, that Caesar's authority didn't just come from the pagan gods, it came from the God of heaven himself. But he placed upon Caesar a limit that they had not realized either, that there was a jurisdiction that was beyond Caesar's authority, that which belongs to God. But God is the source of governmental authority. He is the source of limits on governmental authority. As we'll see as we look to some of the further principles here, he is also the source of human rights. And when you think about this, what other source of human rights could there be but God himself? When the Declaration of Independence says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are not evolved but created equal, the only firm basis for equality, and that they are endowed not by their government with certain negotiable privileges, but by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That's the only firm basis for human rights. if rights come from government, then government can take them away. And in that case, they are not unalienable rights, they are negotiable privileges. We can only say they are unalienable rights if we recognize that they come from a higher source than government. And what source could that be but God himself, not the Constitution, because the Constitution can be amended, but God himself, because his word cannot be amended. Justice William Douglas, one of the most liberal justices in the history of the Supreme Court, but also the son of a Presbyterian minister, had this to say in the case of McGowan versus Maryland. The institutions, this is a 1961 case, the institutions of our society are founded on the belief that there is an authority higher than the state, that there is a moral law which the state is powerless to alter, that the individual possesses rights conferred by the Creator, which government must respect. Inherent in this concept of respect for God and government is the idea of what we call ethical monotheism. Now, let me spell out that term just a little bit. By monotheism, of course, we mean the worship of one God rather than many gods. Now, if there is one God, then there is one truth and there is one law. If we're polytheists, if we believe in many gods, then we could easily believe that this God named Jehovah of the Jews may have given one set of laws, but Marduk of the Babylonians gave another set, and Ra of the Egyptians gave another set, and Zeus of the Greeks still another, and Wotan of the Germans still another. But if there is one God, there is one truth and one higher law. And when we say ethical monotheism, we mean that there is a moral dimension to that law. God gave the law, and the law is right. Now, we could ask the question, did he give the law because it is right, or is it right because he gave it? And the answer to that question is yes. In other words, you can't separate God from his character. So ethical monotheism and the idea that we respect God, interestingly enough, every one of our colonial constitutions at the time the U.S. Constitution was drafted recognized God as the source of governmental authority. The Pennsylvania Constitution even cited Romans 13 as the source for that proposition. Every one of our 50 state constitutions today contains a recognition of God. Now, there's a book that Buzzy and Patsy and I were talking about at dinner last night called Our Godless Constitution, that claims that our Constitution has no mention of God. Interestingly enough, if you look in that book, you'll find they begin by saying that they didn't use footnotes and documentation because the things they are saying are self-evident. Well, that's not the reason they didn't use footnotes and documentation. They didn't use them because their propositions are simply untrue. But obviously, they didn't look at the Article 7, the ratification clause, which says that this Constitution is done in this year of our Lord, 1787. That's not just a recognition of God, that's a recognition of the birth of Jesus Christ as the central event of human history. And that's especially significant because that's a recognition then of the Gregorian calendar, which the Christian order had just shifted over to. In fact, England had only started following the Gregorian calendar about 25 years before. The Founding Fathers had no qualms whatsoever about recognizing Jesus Christ and his birth as the central event of human history. There was a dispute among the American colonists at one time, the early settlers, between John Winthrop of the Puritans in Massachusetts and Roger Williams, who left the Puritans and went down to settle Rhode Island. Winthrop insisted that the entire Decalogue, all 10 of those commandments, apply to civil government. Roger Williams said no, and he said there are two tables of the law. Now, that part I think he's correct. There are two tables. The first table, the vertical table, applies to our duties to God. Thou shalt have no other gods before me, and so on. And that table has no application to government at all. But he said the second table of the law, which he called the horizontal table, deals with our relations to other people. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, bear false witness, and so on. And he said, that does apply to government, but the first part doesn't. The more I've thought about that, the more convinced I am is that Winthrop was right and Roger Williams was wrong. The first table of the law also applies because God is the source of governmental authority. Now let's look at a few other principles that apply here. First of all, respect for life. We see that particularly in the commandment, thou shalt not kill, or as more modern translations more accurately or precisely stated, thou shalt not murder. All murder involves killing, but not all killing is murder. The King James there is not wrong, it's just not as precise. And here we see the sanctity of life itself. And our statutes that we have in all 50 states, and as far as I know, in every country across the world that prohibit murder and other forms of homicide, have their roots in this commandment, thou shalt not kill. Respect for property. Respect for property, we see in the command, thou shalt not steal. And obviously, this involves not only our laws against theft, robbery, burglary, and the like, but extortion, blackmail, fraud, and other such things. And again, this is a recognition that there is a higher law that respects private property. Again, one that is of almost universal application, although different societies have applied this in different ways. Respect, and by the way, some might say this doesn't involve private property because maybe it just involves stealing from the commune or stealing from the state. Well, if you read that commandment by itself, that's what it could mean. But if you take it in context with the last commandment, thou shalt not covet, a commandment, by the way, that is given as a hedge, a protection, an added layer of protection. Thou shalt not covet anything that is thy neighbor's. Clearly, private property is assumed here. And we see this command given as a hedge because we need extra protection, we need extra training. A person who covets his neighbor's property is more likely to commit theft. A person who covets his neighbor's spouse is more likely to commit adultery. People who have been trained not to covet are less likely to commit those violations than people who have not been so trained. And nowhere in the Old Testament, and also nowhere in colonial New England that I've been able to find, was anybody ever executed or otherwise punished simply for coveting. But it's given there as a hedge, an added layer of protection. Respect for family. And we see that in the command, first of all, thou shalt not commit adultery, which used to be illegal in every state and still is illegal in some states. And likewise, honor thy father and thy mother, a command which not only requires respect for parents, and at least while you're under their roof and under their support, obedience to parents as well, but as John Locke would say, and as others have said, this is also the source of all governmental authority, because it is in the authority given to parents, which authority parents delegate to government, that all civil authority ultimately rests. And a final principle, respect for truth. Now we see that clearly in the command, thou shalt not bear false witness. And as to the command against lying, well, really, when you think about it, all civilized communication would be impossible without that command. Why should I bother asking somebody directions as to how I can get to this church, or how I can get to my hotel, or how I can get to the gate for my flight, if I think they're just as likely to lie to me as tell the truth? Communication is possible, or at least intelligent communication is possible, only if we can assume that most people tell the truth at least most of the time. And then also, of course, the command, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, which involves respect for God, but also prohibits not just blasphemy, but also perjury. The various catechisms of the Catholic Church, Luther's catechism, and many others point this out, that it involves any speech which puts God's name in disrepute, and taking God's name in vain by committing perjury is one example of this. And also, it is a means by which we ensure that civil government is going to be able to do justice. George Washington, in his farewell address, asked the question, how would our courts of justice function if it were not for the oaths that ensure that people tell the truth? You know that in the early decades of American history, an atheist was not even allowed to give testimony in court, because people thought at that time, with some good reason I might add, that if a person does not believe that there is a God who sees all and knows all, and who you're not going to fool, even if you can fool the judge and the jury and everybody else, and before whom someday you're going to have to stand and give account, if you don't believe that, you're not to be trusted to tell the truth in court. Now, the purpose of courts is to do justice. If we define justice, as Aristotle did, as rendering to each person what is due, a judge can't perform justice without knowing the truth. Did this defendant who is before me today commit the crime, or didn't he? And if he did, are there extenuating, mitigating, aggravating circumstances I ought to consider in determining the level of the charge or the sentence? To do justice, you have to know truth. And the oaths that we use in court are designed to help us understand the truth. All of this simply means that there are basic principles in the Ten Commandments: respect for God, respect for life, respect for property, respect for family, and respect for truth, that are of universal application and are the foundation of our civil law today. Now, where do we stand today as far as the display of the Ten Commandments in public? Well, the very simple answer to that question is, I don't know. Now, what I mean to say by that is that the courts have not been consistent on this, and we have several cases that come with different results, and each case seems to be very fact-specific, partly because the courts themselves have been so divided. But back in 1980, we had what I think was a terrible case, Stone versus Graham, in which the Supreme Court, by a 5-4 margin, said that a law requiring that the Ten Commandments be displayed in every public school building was unconstitutional. Not one of the justices who decided that case is on the court today, and I think that could be ripe for reconsideration today. In 2005, 2 Ten Commandments cases came before the court. One, McCreary County versus ACLU. In 2005, the court, by a 5-4 margin, said that this Ten Commandments display in a courthouse in McCreary County, Kentucky, was an unconstitutional endorsement of the Christian religion. Now, the same day, in the case of Van Orden versus Perry, coming out of Texas, the Supreme Court, again by a 5-4 margin, said that the Ten Commandments display, as it stood on a monument in the lawn of the Texas State Capitol, was not an establishment of religion and was okay. Justice Breyer was the deciding vote. He saw a difference between those cases. He saw the display in Texas as simply being out there and not endorsing anything in particular, especially since there were many other displays around it. But he made that distinction. But all of this means we don't know for sure where we stand. But part of the reason for this is the insistence of the ACLU and others that we cannot have an establishment of religion, and the Ten Commandments are religious, and therefore we can't have them in public. Well, if the Ten Commandments have the effect of endorsing a religion, may I ask, what religion do they endorse? I actually had this question asked to me by a reporter one time in regard to a Ten Commandments display. The reporter asked me, how do you think a Jew would feel seeing those Ten Commandments? I just answered, why don't you ask Moses? Christians accept the Ten Commandments, Jews accept the Ten Commandments, Muslims accept the Ten Commandments, as do people of many other religions as well. But the fallacy in that whole approach is the idea that everything has to be either religious or secular, and there is no middle ground in between. God established two kingdoms, church and state. He is Lord of both kingdoms, and He has given some things to the church, some things to the state. I will suggest to you He gave the Ten Commandments to both church and state. In this hour, I'm focusing on their role in the state. In the next hour, I'll focus on their role in the church. Now, in that Van Orden versus Perry case, Chief Justice Rehnquist recognized that very clearly, as he said, of course the Ten Commandments are religious, but Moses was a lawgiver as well as a religious leader, and the Ten Commandments have an undeniable historic meaning. And Breyer, in his concurring opinion, the one that really decided the case, Breyer said the same thing. He said, in certain contexts, a display of the tablets of the Ten Commandments can convey not simply a religious message, but also a secular moral message about proper standards of social conduct. And in certain cases, a display of the tablets can also convey a historical message about a historical relation between those standards and the law, a fact that helps to explain the display of those tablets in dozens of courthouses throughout the nation, including in the Supreme Court of the United States. In fact, if you stand outside the Supreme Court building, if you're inside, you'll see the display in several places inside as well, but if you stand outside, if I recall correctly, it is if you're east of the Supreme Court building, you will see what I believe is called a bas-relief at the top, in which you'll see quite a number of lawgivers. Right in the center of all of these is Moses. He is seated, and he is holding these two tablets, the Ten Commandments. On one side of him, standing, but standing not as tall as Moses is seated, on one side of him is Solon, the Greek lawgiver, representing Western law. On the other side of him, also standing and facing Moses, is Confucius, representing Eastern law. But right there in the center, and largest of all, is Moses and the Ten Commandments. And also, when we ask what the court is going to do today, I think we have a new ball game today. With Justice Gorsuch on the court, and now Justice Kavanaugh on the court, we have what is probably the most conservative Supreme Court since the 1930s. And it wouldn't surprise me at all that in a Ten Commandments case to come before the court in the next several years, the court would take a fresh look at this. They've already accepted one case, a case involving a display of a cross that was erected to honor veterans in Bladensburg, Maryland. The American Humanist Association has challenged this. You have a similar case coming out of Pensacola that is up for a petition of cert before the Supreme Court as well, but the court has accepted the Bladensburg case. And anyway, we note that not only does we have a great American tradition. We filed an amicus brief in the case in which we know that not only do we have a great American tradition going all the way back to Columbus and unbroken since then of the public display of the Ten Commandments, but in addition to that, we note that the cross, the display of the cross, I meant to say, but in addition to that, we have an identification of the cross with the military. The highest medal given in the military, except for the Congressional Medal of Honor, is the Distinguished Service Cross, or for Navy and Marines, the Navy Cross or the Air Force Cross. But we also made a note here, and we didn't say this in the brief, but I did say it in the press release talking about it, that really what the American Humanist Association wants to do is take down that cross and put up in its place a 30-foot statue of Count Dracula. Because, like Count Dracula, the American Humanist Association recoils at the sight of the cross. And, well, I don't know if they'll get that humor or not. We'll see. Anyway, I'm going to move on here quickly because what time am I supposed to close this? About now? I'm afraid so. There's so much more that I'd like to go into, but about how the Ten Commandments have been used, how the Mosaic Law has been used by scholars, and a number of Jewish scholars in the last couple decades have started to recognize this. Used this, not Greek and Roman law, as a basis for republican government throughout Europe and in America. But I'd also like us to take a look here, and by the way, I have, in this book, I have one chapter in this book that deals with the use of the Ten Commandments in American courts. And anyway, as I did what we call a Lexis search for Ten Commandments, a computer search of court decisions, I found over 1,000 cases in which American courts of record, that is, state supreme courts or federal courts, have cited the Ten Commandments. I'd like to read every one of those for you. We don't have time. I'm going to give you one. Moore versus Strickland. This is a case from 1899, the Supreme Court of West Virginia. It involved a man who was fired from a state job for having solicited a prostitute. And he said, that's not a basis for firing me. And the law, though, said that you could be fired for any criminal offense that involved moral turpitude, that is, had moral aspects to it. We said, well, what moral aspects do you have to this? Well, the adultery command is what the court said. And here's what the Supreme Court of West Virginia said about the Ten Commandments. These commandments, which like a collection of diamonds bear testimony to their own intrinsic worth, in themselves appeal to us as coming from a superhuman or divine source. And no conscientious or reasonable man has yet been able to find a flaw in them. Absolutely flawless, negative in terms but positive in meaning, they easily stand at the head of our whole moral system, and no nation or people can long continue a happy existence in open violation of them. I have a bunch of place marks here. I was going to cite a whole bunch more of those, but we won't, maybe another time. Anyway, we are past the time that we are to adjourn. I'm simply going to say that God has given us these two kingdoms. He has given us the Ten Commandments for both kingdoms. And we've seen the role the Ten Commandments play in civil law for the state. And in the next hour, we'll look to the role that they play for the church. Let's close with a word of prayer. Dear Father, we thank you that you've given us these Ten Commandments to order our conduct. But we thank you also that you gave them to us to show us our sin. Because only when we understand our sin do we understand our need for the salvation that Christ procured for us by dying in our place on that cross. We pray that you will help us to see the need for those commandments today, to see how they can be misused, but to see how they are properly used. All these things we ask in the name of your Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.